This was the first year I'd be spending Christmas alone. I think it sounds sadder than it was, but I couldn't afford the flight back to my hometown and couldn't take off any extra vacation time to make it worth it. Anyway, I always enjoyed seeing others' decorations and driving or walking around on Christmas Day. When I woke up, I turned on the old cartoon Grinch movie and made a nice breakfast and some coffee. Then I spent the next hour on FaceTime with my parents and siblings. After all that, it was probably around noon. I didn't have much else to do. But at some point, I went out to get the mail. And when I opened the door, there were footprints in the snow on my porch. What's odd is that they were frozen over, like not freshly made in the powdery top layer of snow. They were clearly made hours ago, like overnight, when it was well below freezing. I looked around, even though they clearly were not here anymore. Then went out and got my mail. It was very strange. I don't know if I felt scared, but definitely a bit unsettled. I didn't really know what to do about it, though. I tried to continue my day without worrying too much. After all, it was Christmas. I had some Hallmark movies play while I opened the gifts and letters that my family had sent in the mail around 3. I started getting bored and checked the weather. It was supposed to get a lot colder later in the day, so I decided to go for a walk around the neighborhood. While I still had the chance, I bundled up and started down the sidewalk looking at all the Christmas lights and taking in the calmness a little bit. Into the walk, I noticed someone else walking in the neighborhood. They were the only other person I saw, and they were walking on the other side of the road. I thought nothing of it, but a few minutes later they passed by me again. I did a double take thinking I was seeing things, because there was no way we could have passed each other twice so soon unless they turned around right after we passed each other. The first time I kept walking and came up to a split where I could either head back home or keep going around the neighborhood. I ended up going home. It wasn't because of the guy I saw. Sure, it was strange, but something else just felt off. It made me want to head back. I went in through the front door. Eerily, soon after I got inside, there was a knock at the door. I had only just taken off my boots and was still standing right by the door. My heart pounded in my chest, like I knew this was bad. I looked out the peephole and saw a guy standing very close to the door, wearing a baseball cap tilted downward, covering his face weirdly. He seemed familiar. I didn't know why at the moment. I thought it was just because he was the man I'd seen walking around the neighborhood. He knocked again. I knew he had to have already seen me enter. "What do you need?" I called out. They didn't answer a few seconds later. They banged on the door again. I asked again what they were doing here and what they wanted, and watched out the peephole as he just stood there against the door and refused to answer or speak at all. Before banging on the door again, he then grabbed the door handle and started shoving his whole body into it. I backed away as the whole door shook, rattling from its hinges with each blow. It went on for maybe 20 to 30 seconds. Then it all suddenly stopped. There was a pause, and then multiple people yelling. When I went over and looked, there were 2 cops outside my home arresting the man at my door. I was completely confused and unsure how this happened. I thought it was just some kind of miracle that they showed up at the perfect time. It turned out a neighbor had actually called the police and reported a man acting unusual, walking back and forth down our street for hours and standing outside my home even more disturbing. Though I knew the man, he was an old ex from probably 6 years ago. He didn't even live in the same state as me anymore, and we hadn't talked at all since the breakup. It's scary to think that. So suddenly, years later, he just decided to show up at my house on Christmas Day and try to break in the cops. Found 2 knives on him, and in his car, that he parked a few blocks away, he had a firearm and a whole roll of duct tape. Both that he purchased just a few days prior. He admitted to nothing, but it's not hard to see what he was likely intending to do.
I had spent the whole morning and most of the afternoon with my family. Now it was time to go home and wind down for the night, maybe watch a holiday movie or something. I drove 45 minutes from my parents' house to mine. The roads were empty, as you'd expect on Christmas. If not for the holiday, it would have felt eerie. Everything outside was so quiet and still. I got home around 8 p.m., pulled into the garage, and went inside. Flicking on the entrance light, I immediately noticed papers scattered across the hallway floor. They were from a stack of mail I'd left on the counter. I figured it must have fallen over. I didn't overthink it, just picked everything up and put it back on the counter. I had rushed out that morning, so maybe I bumped into it without noticing. After cleaning it up, I walked around the house, turning on the lights. I went into the living room, where I had a small, fake Christmas tree set up in the corner. It looked pretty sad, but it was better than nothing. I sat on the couch and found a new Christmas movie on Netflix. It was surprisingly good, and I watched the whole thing. But during the movie, I kept hearing faint creaks in the house. They were so quiet I wasn't sure if I was imagining them. Every time I thought I heard something, I paused the movie and listened. But I never heard the sound again. I brushed it off as exhaustion and decided to call it a night. I turned off the TV and the lights downstairs, then went upstairs to my bedroom. As soon as I walked in and turned on the overhead light, I knew something was off. I couldn't pinpoint it at first, but my room wasn't how I'd left it. Something had been moved. Suddenly, all the odd things I'd noticed since coming home started to click together. My body went numb, fear and adrenaline rushing through me. I stepped back into the hallway and looked down the staircase, trying to listen for any sounds. Slowly, I crept downstairs, step by step, until I reached the bottom. There was no sound, no motion. Is anyone here? I've called the cops. I shouted. Hello? It was only after I said that I realized I hadn't actually called the cops yet. I panicked and decided to go back upstairs to lock myself in my room and call 911. But suddenly, footsteps rushed out of the living room. In the dim light, I saw the Christmas tree branches sway and a figure dash away from it. I followed the sound into the kitchen. The back door was wide open, and whoever it was had already escaped. I stood there, frozen. When I snapped out of it, I locked the door and called 911. The police arrived but didn't find much. Nothing seemed to be stolen, at least nothing I noticed. My guess is they broke in just as I was getting home. When they heard the garage door, they must have panicked, knocked over the mail, and hid. What unsettles me the most is the thought that they might have been in the same room while I watched the movie. If they were hiding, it could explain the faint noises I kept hearing. Or maybe there weren't any noises, and my mind was playing tricks on me. Still, the idea of someone sitting in the shadows, silently watching me for hours, is terrifying. I wish I had more answers, but that's all I know. The police weren't much help, and nothing like this has happened since. Hopefully, it stays that way. I'm nearing 30, and Christmas isn't as exciting as it used to be. These days, I usually visit whichever family member is hosting the get-together for the year. I hang out for a few days, then head back home. It's always nice, but the gatherings are often chaotic with so many people. Last year, I decided to rent an Airbnb near my cousin's place, where the family Christmas was being hosted. He lives in a remote area, so my rental options were mostly small cabins. I picked one at random and, a few days before Christmas, drove out there. The first 2 days were great. I caught up with family I hadn't seen in years and had a lot of fun. Then more people arrived, around 30 total, all crammed into a 3-bedroom house. It became a mess. On Christmas morning, we watched the kids open their presents and had a big breakfast. I stayed until dinner but decided to head back to the cabin around 7 p.m. The cabin was tucked away in the trees just outside of town. It was small but nice. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed shoe prints in the snow leading up to the front door. I assumed it was the Airbnb host checking in on me. When I got to the door, it was clear no one had gone inside. The prince stopped at the door and then turned back. I went inside, tossed my jacket on the couch, and sat down in a chair. I thought about texting the host to ask why he stopped by, but figured he'd reach out if it was important. Within minutes of sitting down, I dozed off. I woke up about 10 minutes later to the sound of the doorbell. Groggy, I walked over and opened the door. A man with medium black hair and a brown jacket stood there, smiling faintly. He introduced himself as the Airbnb host and shook my hand. Still half asleep, I let him lead the conversation. He asked how my stay was and said he needed to check on a few things. Without fully processing what he said, I nodded and stepped aside to let him in. It wasn't until he walked past me into the house that I realized I'd agreed to let a stranger in. That thought jolted me awake. He wandered into the living room and stood there, looking around aimlessly. It didn't even seem like he knew what he was checking. Then I remembered it was Christmas Day. Why would he come by now? Couldn't this wait until tomorrow? His behavior felt off, and unease crept in. Hey, do you think you could come back tomorrow? I actually have family coming over any minute, I said, trying to sound casual. He stopped, turned to look at me, and froze. His expression was stiff, almost angry. He slowly walked back toward the front door, but instead of leaving, he locked it. Fear hit me like a wave. I bolted to the bedroom and locked the door behind me. Seconds later, he started pounding on it, trying to break it down. My car keys and phone were still on the couch, so I couldn't call for help or drive away. Desperate, I spotted a small window at the back of the room. It had a handle I could push to open it. The door behind me was bending and cracking under his weight as I squeezed through the window. Once outside, I ran straight into the woods. A few seconds later, I looked back and saw him burst out the front door. Thankfully, the darkness of the woods hid me, and he didn't seem to know where I'd gone. He stayed outside for about 20 minutes, searching, before finally getting in his car and driving off. I waited a little longer to be sure he was gone, then ran back inside, grabbed my phone, and called 911. The police arrived, and during the investigation, the real homeowner and Airbnb host came by. He confirmed he wasn't the man who had come to the cabin. It's likely the intruder found out the cabin was an Airbnb and used that knowledge to gain access. What his intentions were after that, I don't know. But it's clear it wasn't just to steal the mediocre decorations in the cabin. That night was a close call, and I don't think I'll ever be so trusting of strangers again.